Hey guys, tonight we're diving into America's most audacious fever dream, convincing itself it could hurl 3 men at the moon and somehow not kill them in the process. The space race that gave us Tang, Velcro, and the subtle art of spending 4% of your national budget on what was essentially the world's most expensive game of cosmic capture the flag. So before we get comfortable with this tale of rockets and national pride, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching me explain how democracy nearly bankrupted itself trying to one-up the Russians. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what you think about humanity's brief moment of actually getting along long enough to do something impossible. Now settle in, maybe grab some freeze-dried ice cream, and let's explore how America went from being embarrassingly second place in space to pulling off the greatest, hold my beer, moment in human history. So, you think the moon landing was inevitable, adorable, truly, like assuming your GPS will work perfectly during a zombie apocalypse. Before you could even dream of bouncing around on lunar dust like a caffeinated kangaroo, America had to figure out how to not blow itself up with rockets. This wasn't your grandmother's science fair volcano. This was Cold War theater at its most expensive and explosive, where the only talent anyone cared about was, does this country look like it can hurl 3 men at the moon and get them back alive? Step 1. Realize that the Russians beat you to literally everything that mattered in space. First satellite. First man in space, also theirs. First woman in space, still theirs. First dog in space, you guessed it, Russian. America was collecting participation trophies while the Soviet Union was collecting actual victories. And nothing hurts national pride quite like being consistently outperformed by your ideological nemesis in the one arena that really mattered, showing off to the entire planet. The year was 1957, and America's ego had just been shattered by a metal ball the size of a beach volleyball. Sputnik beeped its way across the sky like a celestial middle finger, and suddenly every American looked up at the stars and thought, well, that's embarrassing. The Russians had essentially planted a flag in the cosmos while America was still figuring out how to make rockets that didn't explode on the launch pad like particularly expensive fireworks. President Eisenhower, a man who had orchestrated D-Day and presumably knew a thing or two about complicated operations, watched this unfold with the expression of someone who had just realized he'd forgotten to wear pants to a formal dinner. The military was panicking, Congress was yelling, and somewhere in a bunker, Werner von Braun was probably muttering in German about how he could have told them this would happen if anyone had bothered to ask the former Nazi rocket scientist who'd been sitting around Alabama waiting for someone to take him seriously. But here's the thing about American national pride, it doesn't just bruise, it metastasizes. Within months, NASA was born from the cosmic embarrassment of being second, best in space, like a phoenix rising from the ashes of wounded dignity. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, because nothing says, "We're totally not freaking out about this," quite like creating an entirely new government agency with an acronym that sounds vaguely optimistic. The early days of NASA were less, boldly going where no one has gone before, and more, please, for the love of all that's holy, let this rocket not explode. The Mercury program was America's first attempt at putting humans in space, which sounds noble and pioneering until you realize that the spacecraft were essentially tin cans with attitude controls, designed by engineers who approached human spaceflight with the same optimism as someone assembling IKEA furniture without instructions. Alan Shepard became America's first astronaut in space in 1961, which was thrilling right up until everyone remembered that Yuri Gagarin had already orbited the entire planet a month earlier, while Shepard got a 15-minute suborbital hop that barely qualified as leaving the atmosphere. It was like showing up to a drag race with a bicycle and being proud that you at least crossed the starting line. John Glenn's orbital flight in 1962 was America's first real space victory, assuming you ignored the fact that the Russians had already done it better, and done it longer. Glenn circled the Earth 3 times while Mission Control held its collective breath and tried to figure out whether the heat shield was actually loose or if the instruments were just having trust issues. Nothing builds confidence in your space program quite like the nagging suspicion that your hero might become a very expensive meteor on re-entry. But somewhere between the explosions and the near misses and the constant humiliation of being the second best space power on a superpower planet, a young president with excellent hair and questionable judgment decided that America needed a goal so audacious, so ridiculously ambitious, that achieving it would erase all memory of those early embarrassments. John F. Kennedy stood before Congress in 1961 and declared that America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. This was roughly equivalent to announcing that America would also learn to fly by flapping its arms really hard, except with more math and significantly higher chances of incineration. The moon was 240,000 miles away. America had managed to keep a man alive in space for exactly 15 minutes. The engineering gap between these two achievements was approximately the size of the moon itself. But Kennedy delivered this promise with the confidence of a man who had clearly never tried to assemble anything more complicated than a ham sandwich. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Engineers choked on their coffee. Accountants fainted. Rocket scientists started drinking heavily. The Russians, meanwhile, probably laughed so hard they nearly fell off their own moon program, which, unbeknownst to most Americans, was already well underway and significantly ahead of anything NASA had even dreamed of attempting. But here's what Kennedy understood that everyone else missed. Sometimes the best way to achieve the impossible is to commit to it so publicly and dramatically that failure becomes more embarrassing than the attempt itself. He had essentially written a check that the entire American aerospace industry would have to cash, and the penalty for bouncing that check would be measured in national humiliation on a scale that would make Sputnik look like a minor social media embarrassment. NASA's budget exploded faster than an early Vanguard rocket. By the mid-1960s, the space agency was consuming roughly 4% of the entire federal budget, which meant that getting to the moon was literally more important to the American government than most of the things governments typically worry about. Roads could wait. Education could wait. The moon, however, could not wait, because the Russians were probably already planning their lunar picnic. The Apollo program was born from this fever dream of national ambition and Cold War paranoia. The name itself came from NASA's slightly pretentious habit of naming things after Greek gods, as if divine intervention might help overcome the small matter of rocket science being approximately as reliable as a chocolate teapot in August. Apollo would be NASA's attempt to build a spacecraft capable of traveling to the moon, landing on it, and returning safely, which was only slightly more complicated than teaching elephants to tap dance. The first challenge was figuring out how to actually get to the moon, which turned out to be more complex than simply pointing a rocket at the bright thing in the sky and lighting the fuse. There were orbital mechanics to consider, trajectory calculations that made calculus look like finger painting, and the small matter of the moon being a moving target that wouldn't politely wait for America to figure out its problems. NASA's initial plan was called direct ascent, which involved building a rocket so monumentally huge that it could carry enough fuel to fly directly to the moon and back without stopping for gas. This rocket would have been roughly the size of a skyscraper and about as practical as using a cannon to deliver mail. The fuel requirements alone would have bankrupted several small nations, and the engineering challenges would have made the pyramids look like a weekend hobby project. Fortunately, a relatively unknown engineer named John Hubbolt had a better idea, though getting anyone to listen to him required the persistence of someone trying to convince a cat to take a bath. Hubbolt proposed something called lunar orbit rendezvous, which sounded complicated because it was complicated, but was still significantly less insane than building a rocket the size of Manhattan. The basic concept was elegantly simple and terrifyingly complex at the same time. Instead of flying directly to the moon and back, the Apollo spacecraft would consist of 3 parts: a command module that would stay in lunar orbit, a lunar module that would actually land on the moon, and a service module that would provide power and life support for most of the journey. The astronauts would fly to the moon in all 3 pieces. 2 of them would descend to the surface in the lunar module, while the third waited in orbit, like the world's most anxious taxi driver. And then the lunar module would blast off from the moon, dock with the command module in orbit, and everyone would fly home together in the command module after abandoning the other pieces like expensive space junk. This plan required perfect execution of maneuvers that had never been attempted, in an environment where the slightest mistake would result in death, using technology that hadn't been invented yet. NASA looked at this proposal and decided it was brilliant, which tells you something about the quality of the alternatives they'd been considering. The Saturn V rocket was America's answer to the question, how do we build something powerful enough to throw 3 men at the moon? The answer, it turned out, was to build the largest, most powerful rocket in human history, standing 36 stories tall and weighing 6 million pounds when fully fueled. The Saturn V was essentially a controlled explosion pointed skyward, generating 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, which was enough power to supply a small city's electricity needs for several minutes, if you could figure out how to harness it for something other than escaping Earth as gravitational embrace. Building the Saturn V required the combined efforts of over 400,000 people spread across thousands of companies in dozens of states, because apparently it takes a village to hurl someone at the moon. Boeing built the first stage, North American Aviation built the second stage and the command module. Douglas Aircraft built the third stage, and Grumman built the lunar module. Coordinating this effort was like conducting an orchestra where every musician was playing a different song in a different key, while sitting in a different time zone. The first stage alone contained 5 F-1 engines, each one capable of generating more thrust than all the rocket engines America had ever built combined up to that point. These engines burned a mixture of kerosene and liquid oxygen at the rate of 15 tons per second, which meant that during the first stage's 2.5 minute burn time, it would consume more fuel than most people use to heat their homes for several years. The sound of these engines firing simultaneously was loud enough to be heard 25 miles away and powerful enough to shake buildings for miles around the launch site. NASA had essentially built a rocket that announced its presence to 3 states at once. The command module was where the astronauts would spend most of their 8-day journey to the moon and back. Assuming everything went according to plan, and they didn't end up spending eternity as the solar system's most well-educated space debris, the command module was roughly the size of a large closet, which meant that 3 grown men would be sharing a space smaller than most people's bathrooms for the better part of a week, with no privacy, no personal space, and no ability to step outside for fresh air. The interior of the command module looked like the cockpit of a commercial airliner that had been designed by someone who had never actually seen a commercial airliner, but had heard one described by someone who was colorblind and possibly having a stroke. There were switches and gauges, and displays covering every available surface, each one controlling some vital system that could kill everyone aboard if operated incorrectly. The astronauts had to memorize the location and function of hundreds of these controls, because there was no user manual thick enough to consult during an emergency, and certainly no technical support hotline to call from lunar orbit. The lunar module was perhaps the strangest spacecraft ever built, looking less like a sleek rocket ship and more like a mechanical spider that had been assembled by someone with a tenuous grasp of geometry. It was designed for only one purpose, like landing on the moon and returning to lunar orbit, which meant it didn't need to be aerodynamic or pretty or comfortable. It just needed to work, which was a surprisingly difficult requirement, given that it was essentially an untested design, being used for the first time in an environment where failure meant death. The lunar module consisted of 2 stages: the descent stage, which contained the engine and fuel needed to land on the moon, and the ascent stage, which contained the engine and fuel needed to blast off from the moon and return to orbit. The ascent stage would literally blow the descent stage apart during takeoff, using explosive bolts to separate the 2 halves, which meant that half of the lunar module was essentially a one-time use item that would be abandoned on the moon forever. NASA's astronauts were selected from military test pilots because apparently the qualifications for moon travel were comfortable with untested aircraft and unlikely to panic when things explode. These were men who had spent their careers flying experimental jets, that had a disturbing tendency to fall apart in mid-flight. So the prospect of riding a controlled explosion to the moon probably seemed like a natural career progression. The astronaut selection process was less job interview and more extended psychological evaluation with occasional physical torture. Candidates were subjected to tests that would have been considered war crimes if conducted by enemy nations. They were spun in centrifuges until they lost consciousness, locked in sensory deprivation chambers until they hallucinated, and subjected to stress tests that were designed to identify the exact point at which a human being's sanity would snap under pressure. The physical requirements were equally demanding. Flat feet were disqualifying, presumably because NASA had learned from Rome's recruitment standards. Poor eyesight was out. Any history of mental illness in your family tree was grounds for rejection, which meant that NASA's astronauts came from bloodlines that were either genuinely stable or exceptionally good at hiding their crazy relatives. Height mattered more than you might expect, not because tall astronauts were better at reaching things in zero gravity, but because the spacecraft were built for men of specific dimensions, and anyone who didn't fit the template would spend the entire mission either bumping their head or unable to reach the controls. NASA had essentially standardized human spaceflight around the dimensions of a 1960s test pilot, which was probably somewhere between 5'8" and 6'2", with the muscle tone of someone who exercised regularly and the emotional stability of someone who had never been particularly bothered by the possibility of sudden death. Training for Apollo was less, learning new skills, and more, preparing for every conceivable way the mission could kill you. The astronauts spent months learning to pilot the command module and lunar module using simulators that were designed to fail in creative and unpredictable ways. The instructors, who apparently took sadistic pleasure in their work, would introduce equipment failures at the worst possible moments, forcing the astronauts to solve life-threatening problems while their spacecraft spun out of control in simulated lunar orbit. They learned geology because someone at NASA had realized that it might be useful if the first humans on the moon could tell the difference between an interesting rock and a boring rock. They learned photography because the entire world would want to see pictures, and there was no point in traveling 240,000 miles just to come back with blurry snapshots that looked like they'd been taken by someone's uncle at a wedding. They learned to work in pressurized suits that made every simple task feel like performing surgery while wearing oven mitts. The spacesuits were marvels of engineering that kept the astronauts alive in the vacuum of space while allowing them just enough mobility to walk, bend, and operate controls with the grace and dexterity of someone wearing a suit of medieval armor filled with marshmallows. The first Apollo missions were tests, because NASA had learned from bitter experience that it was better to discover fatal flaws in Earth orbit than in lunar orbit. Apollo 1 never made it off the launch pad, and the 3 astronauts aboard died in a cabin fire during a routine test, which was NASA's brutal reminder that spaceflight was not a forgiving business, and that even the simplest procedures could turn lethal without warning. The fire led to a complete redesign of the command module's interior, because apparently the first version had been built with materials that burned about as enthusiastically as a pile of newspaper soaked in gasoline. The new design used fireproof materials and a pure oxygen atmosphere at reduced pressure, which meant that future astronauts would be breathing air that was technically safer, but felt like trying to breathe at the top of Mount Everest. Apollo 4 through Apollo 6 were unmanned test flights designed to prove that the Saturn V rocket wouldn't explode on the launch pad, which was a surprisingly difficult thing to prove, given the rocket's tendency to vibrate itself apart during flight. The Saturn V's engines were so powerful that they created structural loads the rocket wasn't entirely designed to handle, leading to a phenomenon called pogo oscillation that made the entire rocket bounce up and down like a 36-story pogo stick traveling at several thousand miles per hour. Apollo 7 was NASA's first manned mission after the Apollo 1 fire, and it was essentially a test to see whether astronauts could survive in the redesigned command module without suffocating, burning to death, or going insane from cabin fever. The crew spent 11 days in Earth orbit, during which they proved that the command module worked, the life support systems functioned, and three men could indeed coexist in a space the size of a large closet without killing each other, though they came closer to that last point than NASA was entirely comfortable with. Apollo 8 was the mission that changed everything, though it probably seemed like a terrible idea at the time. Instead of continuing to test systems in the safety of Earth orbit, NASA decided to send 3 astronauts to the Moon for Christmas 1968, not to land, but simply to orbit the Moon and come back. This was roughly equivalent to deciding that your next driving lesson should involve the Indianapolis 500, but NASA was running out of time to meet Kennedy's deadline, and the Russians were rumored to be close to their own lunar missions. Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders became the first humans to leave Earth orbit, the first to see the far side of the Moon, and the first to experience the profound loneliness of being 240,000 miles from home with nothing but the void of space in every direction. They also became the first humans to see Earth from the distance of the Moon, a blue marble hanging in the blackness of space, and their photograph of Earth rising over the lunar horizon became one of the most famous images in human history. Apollo 8 proved that NASA could navigate to the Moon and back, but it also revealed just how far they were from the surface. The astronauts flew within 70 miles of the lunar surface, close enough to see the craters and mountains in stark detail, but still separated from their ultimate goal by a gap that might as well have been filled with dragons for all the confidence NASA had in their ability to cross it safely. Apollo 9 was a test of the lunar module in Earth orbit, where NASA's engineers could watch their latest creation attempt to function in the vacuum of space without risking anyone's life if it failed spectacularly. The lunar module passed its tests, proving that it could separate from the command module, fly independently, and dock successfully, all while maintaining the life support systems that would keep the astronauts alive during their brief stay on the Moon. Apollo 10 was the dress rehearsal, the final test before the real thing. Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan flew to the Moon, separated the lunar module from the command module in lunar orbit, and descended to within 9 miles of the lunar surface before aborting the landing and returning to the command module. They proved that every system worked. Every procedure was sound, and the only thing standing between NASA and the Moon was the courage to actually attempt the landing. The lunar module used for Apollo 10 was deliberately loaded with insufficient fuel to land and return, because NASA's mission planners were apparently worried that the crew might get carried away and attempt the first lunar landing without permission, which would have been embarrassing for everyone involved and potentially fatal for the astronauts who tried it. Apollo 11 was the culmination of everything NASA had learned, built, and tested over the previous 8 years. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were selected for the historic mission based on their experience, their skills, and probably their ability to handle the pressure of being the most famous astronauts in history if they succeeded, or the most infamous if they failed spectacularly on live television in front of the entire world. The crew of Apollo 11 was as different as 3 men could be, while still sharing the common qualification of being willing to ride a rocket to the Moon. Neil Armstrong was the commander, a civilian test pilot who spoke in measured sentences and displayed the emotional range of someone reading a grocery list. He had previously flown the X-15 experimental aircraft to the edge of space and had commanded Gemini 8, during which he had calmly resolved a life-threatening malfunction that would have killed a less experienced pilot. Buzz Aldrin was the lunar module pilot, an Air Force colonel with a doctorate in astronautics who had written his thesis on orbital mechanics and could probably calculate a trajectory to the Moon in his head while eating breakfast. Aldrin was known for his technical expertise and his willingness to explain complicated concepts to anyone who would listen, whether they wanted to hear about orbital rendezvous techniques or not. Michael Collins was the command module pilot, the astronaut who would remain in lunar orbit while his crewmates descended to the surface. Collins would spend 21 hours alone in lunar orbit, out of radio contact with Earth for 48 minutes of every orbit as he passed behind the Moon, making him temporarily the most isolated human being in the solar system. He accepted this role with the grace of someone who understood that every mission needed someone to bring the car around after the party was over. The launch of Apollo 11 on July 16, 1969, was watched by an estimated 650 million people around the world, which meant that roughly 1/6 of the human population was holding its collective breath as 3 Americans sat atop a controlled explosion that was either going to make history or create a very expensive fireworks display. The Saturn V lifted off from Kennedy Space Center at 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time with the smooth precision of something that had been tested, retested, and tested again by people who understood that failure was not an option. The first stage burned for 2.5 minutes, accelerating the entire 3,000-ton assembly from 0 to 6,000 miles per hour while consuming fuel at a rate that would empty an Olympic swimming pool in 25 seconds. The noise was indescribable, the vibration was overwhelming, and the acceleration pressed the astronauts into their seats with a force 3 times their body weight, making them feel like they weighed 600 pounds each. The second stage ignited with a gentler push that accelerated them to 15,000 miles per hour and carried them most of the way to Earth orbit. The third stage provided the final boost to orbital velocity 17,500 miles per hour, fast enough to circle the Earth every 90 minutes, and officially making them astronauts by any reasonable definition of the term. After 1.5 orbits around Earth, during which mission control verified that all systems were functioning normally and the astronauts hadn't changed their minds about flying to the moon, the third stage reignited for the trans-lunar injection burn, accelerating them to 25,000 miles per hour and sending them on a trajectory that would carry them to the moon in 3 days. The journey to the moon was 3 days of floating in a tin can, watching Earth shrink from a world to a continent to a country to a bright blue dot that could be covered with a thumb held at arm's length. The astronauts ate food that had been dried, rehydrated, and packaged in ways that made it technically edible, but not particularly enjoyable. They slept in sleeping bags attached to the cabin walls, floating in zero gravity like human decorations, and they used a waste management system that was so complicated and unpleasant that NASA's engineers had apparently designed it as a practical joke on future space travelers. The command module's heat shield faced away from the sun during most of the journey, creating a temperature difference between the sunny side and the shaded side that was extreme enough to cook dinner on one wall while freezing water on the opposite wall. The spacecraft slowly rotated during the journey to distribute the heat evenly, a technique called passive thermal control, but nicknamed barbecue mode, by astronauts who appreciated the comparison to slowly cooking meat over an open fire. 3 days after leaving Earth, Apollo 11 arrived at the moon and fired its engine to enter lunar orbit, a maneuver that had to be performed on the far side of the moon, out of radio contact with Earth, with no possibility of assistance if something went wrong. Mission Control watched their screens go blank as the spacecraft disappeared behind the moon and waited 25 agonizing minutes to learn whether the orbital insertion burn had been successful or whether Apollo 11 had crashed into the moon, skipped off into deep space, or simply vanished into the cosmic void. When radio contact was re-established and Armstrong's voice crackled across 240,000 miles of space to report that the burn had been successful and Apollo 11 was safely in lunar orbit, Mission Control erupted in controlled celebration that was probably audible in the parking lot. NASA had successfully delivered 3 astronauts to the moon. Now came the hard part, landing on it. The next day, Armstrong and Aldrin crawled through the tunnel connecting the command module to the lunar module, sealed the hatch behind them, and began the final preparations for humanity's first attempt to land on another world. The lunar module, call sign Eagle, separated from the command module, call sign Columbia, and began its powered descent to the lunar surface while Collins remained in orbit, maintaining radio contact and preparing for the possibility that he might return to Earth alone if the landing went catastrophically wrong. The powered descent was supposed to be automatic, controlled by a computer that would guide Eagle to a safe landing site that had been selected from photographs taken by previous missions. The computer had been programmed with the coordinates of a smooth area in the Sea of Tranquility, a region of the moon that looked flat and boring in photographs, which were exactly the qualities NASA wanted in a landing site for their first attempt. But as Eagle descended toward the lunar surface, Armstrong realized that the computer was guiding them toward a crater filled with boulders the size of automobiles, which would have made landing roughly as safe as trying to park a helicopter in a rock quarry during an earthquake. With fuel running dangerously low and alarms sounding in the cockpit, Armstrong took manual control of Eagle and began searching for a safer landing spot while Aldrin called out altitude and fuel, remaining in the calm voice of someone who had trained for exactly this situation and was determined not to panic even if they were about to crash into the moon. 60 seconds, called mission control, meaning that Eagle had 60 seconds of fuel remaining before they would have to abort the landing and return to orbit. Assuming they could accomplish the abort before running out of fuel entirely and crashing into the moon in a brief, spectacular, and historically significant fireball, Armstrong flew Eagle over the boulder field, scanning the lunar surface for anywhere flat enough to land a spacecraft that had never been tested in actual lunar conditions and was currently being piloted by someone who had trained for this moment in simulators, but had never actually landed anything on the moon before, for the obvious reason that no one had ever landed anything on the moon before. 30 seconds, called mission control, and by now everyone in the control room was holding their breath, watching the fuel gauge drop towards zero and waiting to learn whether humanity's first attempt to land on the moon would end in triumph or tragedy. Armstrong spotted a relatively clear area beyond the boulder field and guided Eagle toward it, bleeding off altitude and velocity with the precision of someone who had spent thousands of hours in simulators learning to land a spacecraft that handled like nothing that had ever flown before. The lunar module's engine could only be throttled between 60 and 10% of maximum thrust, which meant that the final moments of the landing had to be performed with an engine that was either too powerful or barely powerful enough, with no middle ground for comfortable maneuvering. Contact light, called Aldrin as sensors on Eagle's landing legs detected contact with the lunar surface. Armstrong shut down the engine, and Eagle settled onto the moon with a gentle bump that marked the end of humanity's 300,000-year journey from the African savanna to the Sea of Tranquility. The Eagle has landed, Armstrong reported to Mission Control, a phrase that was immediately transmitted around the world and marked the moment when science fiction became historical fact. NASA had successfully landed 2 human beings on the surface of the moon, something that had been considered impossible by serious scientists just a decade earlier, and was still considered impossible by people who hadn't been paying attention to the last 8 years of American space development. Mission Control erupted in celebration that was definitely audible in the parking lot this time, and probably detectable on seismographs for several miles around Houston. Engineers and flight controllers who had spent years calculating trajectories and testing systems and solving problems that had never existed before finally allowed themselves to believe that the impossible had become possible, and that John F. Kennedy's audacious promise was going to be kept with 5 months to spare before the decade's end. Armstrong and Aldrin had originally been scheduled to rest for several hours after landing, because NASA's mission planners had assumed that successfully landing on the moon would be exhausting, and that the astronauts would need time to recover before attempting their historic moonwalk. But Armstrong and Aldrin were too excited and too aware of their place in history to spend their first hours on the moon sleeping in a spacecraft that looked like a mechanical spider and probably smelled like the interior of a hockey equipment after a long season. They convinced Mission Control to let them begin preparations for the moonwalk immediately, which involved putting on spacesuits that were essentially personal spacecraft, complete with life support systems, pressure regulation, and thermal control. The suits were marvels of 1960s engineering that allowed the astronauts to survive in an environment that would kill them instantly while still providing enough mobility to walk, bend, collect samples, and take photographs for the historical record. 6.5 hours after landing on the moon, Neil Armstrong opened Eagle's hatch and became the first human being to step onto the surface of another world. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," he said, though the radio transmission was scratchy enough that people have been arguing about whether he said, "a man," or just "man." ever since, which proves that humans will find something to debate about even during the most historically significant moments imaginable. 19 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin joined Armstrong on the lunar surface and became the second human being to walk on the moon, a distinction that guaranteed him a place in history, but also meant that he would spend the rest of his life being introduced as the second man on the moon, which was simultaneously one of the greatest achievements in human history and a perpetual reminder that being second is never quite as memorable as being first. The two astronauts spent 2.5 hours exploring the lunar surface, collecting samples, conducting experiments, and taking photographs that would be studied and admired for decades afterward. They planted an American flag in the lunar soil, not as a territorial claim, but as a symbol of the nation that had achieved the impossible through a combination of political will, engineering brilliance, and the kind of sustained effort that requires spending 4% of your national budget on a single goal for the better part of a decade. They also planted a plaque that read, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind," which was a remarkably diplomatic sentiment for a mission that had been motivated primarily by Cold War competition and national pride, but which accurately reflected the historic significance of what they had accomplished. The moon itself was exactly as forbidding and alien as anyone could have imagined. There was no atmosphere, no weather, no sound except what was transmitted through their spacesuits and radio communications. The sky was black during the lunar day, filled with stars that were invisible from Earth's surface, but blazed with startling clarity in the lunar vacuum. The sun cast harsh shadows with no atmospheric softening, creating a landscape of brilliant highlights and impenetrable darkness that looked like a high-contrast photograph of a world that had never known life. The lunar soil, which NASA had worried might be quicksand, deep and swallow the lunar module, turned out to be firm enough to walk on, but fine enough to stick to everything it touched. The astronauts' boots left crisp footprints in the soil that would remain unchanged for millions of years, preserved in a world without wind or water to erase the evidence of their historic visit. After 2.5 hours on the surface, Armstrong and Aldrin returned to Eagle and prepared for the most dangerous part of their missions, leaving the moon. The ascent stage would have to fire its engine perfectly on the first try, because there were no second chances in lunar orbit and no possibility of rescue if something went wrong. The engine that would carry them back to Michael Collins and the command module had never been tested in lunar gravity and vacuum, because there was no way to test it on Earth under the conditions it would face on the moon. The ascent stage fired perfectly, blasting away from the descent stage with enough force to tear Eagle in half and send the upper portion racing toward orbit at 3,000 miles per hour. The engine burned for 7 minutes, accelerating the astronauts from the lunar surface to orbital velocity, and when it shut down, Armstrong and Aldrin were safely in orbit around the moon, roughly 240,000 miles from home, but no longer stranded on the lunar surface. The rendezvous and docking with Columbia required precision that would have impressed a Swiss watchmaker, because two spacecraft moving at 3,600 miles per hour in lunar orbit have very little room for error when attempting to meet in three-dimensional space. Michael Collins had spent 21 hours alone in lunar orbit, calculating approach trajectories and preparing for the docking that would reunite the crew, and when Eagle's ascent stage appeared on his horizon exactly where, and when it was supposed to, the relief in his voice was audible across 240,000 miles of space. The docking was successful. Armstrong and Aldrin transferred back to Columbia with their precious cargo of lunar samples, and Eagle's ascent stage was jettisoned to crash back into the moon, because NASA had learned that it was cheaper to abandon hardware on the moon than to bring it back to Earth, where it would serve no purpose other than taking up space in a museum. The journey back to Earth was 3 more days of floating in a tin can, but this time with the satisfaction of having accomplished something that would be remembered as long as human civilization endured. They had gone to the moon and returned safely, fulfilling Kennedy's promise with 5 months to spare and proving that America could achieve the impossible when it committed its full resources and attention to a goal that mattered. The splashdown in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969, was witnessed by recovery ships, television cameras, and what felt like the entire population of Earth. Columbia descended through the atmosphere protected by the same heat shield that had kept the astronauts safe during their journey to the moon. And when the parachutes deployed and the command module settled gently into the Pacific waves, NASA had successfully completed the most complex and dangerous mission in human history. The astronauts were immediately quarantined for 3 weeks, because NASA's scientists were concerned about the possibility that lunar microorganisms might pose a threat to Earth's ecosystem, which in retrospect seems charmingly optimistic about the possibility of life on a world that had been bombarded by radiation and meteorites for 4 billion years without developing so much as a lunar moss. The quarantine turned out to be unnecessary because the moon was exactly as sterile and lifeless as it appeared. But it gave the astronauts time to decompress from their historic journey and probably helped them adjust to the reality that they had become the most famous people on Earth simply by traveling farther from Earth than anyone had ever traveled before. America had won the space race not through superior technology or better scientists, but through the simple expedient of committing more resources to the goal than anyone else was willing to spend. The Apollo program employed over 400,000 people and cost $25 billion in 1973 dollars, which would be roughly $150 billion today, making it one of the most expensive peacetime projects in American history. But the investment had paid off in ways that went far beyond Cold War bragging rights. NASA had developed technologies that would revolutionize computing, materials science, telecommunications, and dozens of other fields. The integrated circuits that guided Apollo to the moon would evolve into the microprocessors that would power the personal computer revolution. The lightweight materials developed for spacecraft would find their way into everything from tennis rackets to commercial aircraft. More importantly, America had proven to itself and to the world that democracy could achieve things that seemed impossible if it could muster the political will and financial commitment necessary to sustain a decade-long effort. The Soviet Union had gotten to space first, but America had gotten to the moon first, and in the grand accounting of human achievement, being first to land on another world carried more historical weight than being first to orbit this one. The success of Apollo 11 also marked the beginning of the end of America's moon program, which was one of those ironies that would have been funny if it hadn't been so tragically predictable. Kennedy's goal had been to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade, and once that goal was achieved, Congress began asking uncomfortable questions about why America needed to keep spending enormous amounts of money to send more astronauts to collect more moon rocks from different parts of the same dead world. Apollo 12 landed on the moon 4 months later, proving that the first landing hadn't been a fluke and that NASA could repeat the achievement with the casual precision of a well-rehearsed magic trick. Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon flew to the Ocean of Storms and landed within walking distance of Surveyor 3, an unmanned probe that had been sitting on the lunar surface for 2.5 years, which demonstrated that NASA could now navigate to the moon with the accuracy of a pizza delivery service. Conrad and Bean spent 31 hours on the lunar surface, collected more samples, conducted more experiments, and proved that humans could work effectively on the moon for extended periods without going insane or dying from the various hazards that lunar exploration presented. They also demonstrated that the lunar module was reliable enough for routine operations, assuming that anything involving rocket-powered flight to another world could ever be considered routine. Apollo 13 launched in April 1970 with the goal of landing in the Fremoro Highlands, which sounded like an excellent plan right up until an oxygen tank exploded 2 days into the mission and turned what should have been humanity's third lunar landing into NASA's most desperate rescue operation. Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes suddenly found themselves 200,000 miles from home in a spacecraft that was rapidly losing power, heat, and breathable air, with no possibility of rescue except their own ingenuity and the collective brilliance of NASA's engineers working around the clock to invent solutions to problems that had never existed before. The explosion crippled the command module's life support systems and electrical power, forcing the crew to abandon their main spacecraft and move into the lunar module, which had been designed to keep 2 men alive for 2 days on the lunar surface, not 3 men alive for 4 days in the vacuum of space. Mission Control had to figure out how to stretch the lunar module's consumables to last twice as long while supporting 50% more people, which was roughly equivalent to making a motorcycle sidecar carry a family of 5 from New York to Los Angeles. The most immediate problem was carbon dioxide poisoning, because the lunar module's life support system could not process the CO2 produced by 3 men for 4 days, and without some kind of improvised solution, the crew would suffocate long before they could return to Earth. NASA's engineers had to design a way to connect the command module's square carbon dioxide scrubbers to the lunar module's round receptacles, using only materials that were available on the spacecraft, which turned out to be plastic bags, cardboard, duct tape, and the kind of desperate creativity that emerges when human lives depend on making incompatible systems work together. The solution they developed looked like something but had been assembled by a particularly inventive 5-year-old, but it worked, and the crew of Apollo 13 returned safely to Earth after a journey that had tested every backup system, every emergency procedure, and every ounce of courage that 3 astronauts and several hundred engineers could muster. Their safe return was celebrated as NASA's finest hour, which was probably true, but it was also a reminder that moon travel was still dangerous enough to kill people in creative and unexpected ways. Apollo 13's near disaster led to extensive modifications of the command module's oxygen system and emergency procedures, because NASA had learned that backup systems were only useful if they actually worked when you needed them, and redundancy was only valuable if the redundant systems didn't all fail simultaneously due to the same design flaw. Apollo 14 finally completed the Fra-Moro mission that Apollo 13 had been forced to abandon, with Alan Shepard, Edgar Mitchell, and Stuart Roosa proving that NASA could learn from its mistakes and continue lunar exploration despite the risks involved. Shepard, America's first astronaut, became the 5th human being to walk on the moon, and celebrated by hitting 2 golf balls with a makeshift 6-iron, because apparently even the lunar surface wasn't immune to the universal human impulse to play games in inappropriate locations. Apollo 15, 16, and 17 were the missions where NASA finally got serious about lunar science, extending the surface stays to 3 days and bringing along a lunar rover that allowed the astronauts to travel several miles from their landing sites in search of interesting rocks and geological formations. The rover was essentially a dune buggy designed for a world without air, weather, or gasoline stations. But it worked perfectly and allowed the later Apollo crews to accomplish more scientific work in 3 days than the earlier crews had managed in a few hours of walking around near their landing sites. David Scott and James Irwin spent 3 days exploring the Hadley, Apennine region during Apollo 15, driving their rover across lunar terrain that would have challenged a mountain goat and collecting samples that would keep geologists busy for decades. They also demonstrated the famous feather and hammer drop that proved Galileo's theory about objects falling at the same rate in a vacuum, which was probably the most expensive physics demonstration in history, but was also elegantly simple proof of a fundamental principle that had been accepted on theoretical grounds for centuries. John Young and Charles Duke explored the Descartes Highlands during Apollo 16, searching for evidence of ancient lunar volcanism that turned out not to exist, which was disappointing for the geologists who had planned the mission, but was still valuable for science, because proving that your hypothesis is wrong is almost as useful as proving that it's right, and significantly more expensive when the hypothesis testing requires travel to another world. Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt spent 3 days exploring the Taurus, Littrow Valley during Apollo 17, which was notable for being the only Apollo mission to carry a professional scientist to the moon. Schmitt was a geologist who had trained to be an astronaut, rather than an astronaut who had trained to collect rocks, and his presence on the crew demonstrated that NASA was finally taking lunar science as seriously as lunar politics. Apollo 17 also had the distinction of being humanity's last visit to the moon, though nobody realized it at the time. Cernan's final words before leaving the lunar surface were, "We leave as we came and, God willing, as we shall return." with peace and hope for all mankind, which turned out to be optimistically premature since no human being has been back to the moon in the 5 decades since Cernan spoke those words. The end of the Apollo program was as politically inevitable as its beginning had been politically necessary. Once America had demonstrated its technological superiority by landing on the moon, continuing to spend enormous amounts of money on additional lunar missions became harder to justify to a Congress that had other priorities and to a public that had grown bored with moon landings after the novelty wore off. The final 3 Apollo missions were cancelled due to budget cuts, which meant that NASA had built Saturn V rockets and spacecraft that would never be used for their intended purpose, like having a Formula One race car that you only drive to the grocery store. The unused hardware ended up in museums, where it serves as a monument to both American technological achievement and American political short-sightedness. The Soviet lunar program, which had been racing toward the moon throughout the 1960s, was quietly cancelled after Apollo 11's success made it clear that second place in the space race would be forgotten by history as quickly as second place in any other competition. The Russians had built their own moon rocket, the N-1, but it had a disturbing tendency to explode during test flights, and after 4 consecutive failures, the Soviet government decided that spending enormous resources to be second to the moon was not worth the effort. Years later, after the Cold War ended and Soviet archives were opened, the world learned that the space race had been much closer than anyone had realized at the time. The Russians had been developing lunar spacecraft and training cosmonauts for moon missions throughout the 1960s, and if their N-1 rocket had worked properly, the first words spoken from the lunar surface might have been in Russian rather than English, which would have changed the entire narrative of human space exploration and probably American politics for decades afterward. But the N-1 never worked. The Russians never made it to the moon, and America's achievement remained unique in human history. For a brief moment in 1969, America had accomplished something that no other nation on Earth could match, and the psychological impact of that achievement resonated far beyond the realm of space exploration. The moon landing proved that democracy could mobilize resources and sustain long-term projects just as effectively as totalitarian systems, which was not necessarily obvious in 1961, when Kennedy made his promise and the Soviet Union seemed to be winning the space race through superior central planning and single-minded focus. Apollo demonstrated that free societies could achieve seemingly impossible goals if they could agree on what those goals should be and maintain political commitment long enough to see them through to completion. The technological spillovers from Apollo would reshape entire industries over the following decades. The integrated circuits developed for spacecraft guidance systems would evolve into the microprocessors that powered the personal computer revolution. The materials science advances that produced lightweight, high-strength spacecraft components would find applications in everything from commercial aviation to sports equipment. The miniaturization techniques that allowed complex systems to fit inside spacecraft would enable the development of portable electronics that would have been science fiction in 1961. Perhaps more importantly, Apollo changed humanity's perspective on Earth itself. The photographs of Earth taken from lunar orbit and the lunar surface showed the planet as a small, blue, fragile-looking world hanging in the black void of space, without the political boundaries that seemed so important to people living on its surface. These images helped inspire the environmental movement of the 1970s and gave humanity its first visceral understanding of Earth as a single, interconnected system rather than a collection of separate nations competing for resources. The astronauts who walked on the moon became instant celebrities and spent the rest of their lives trying to explain an experience that was literally unprecedented in human history. They had seen Earth from 240,000 miles away, walked on a world without life or atmosphere, and returned with perspectives that no other humans could share. Most of them handled this unique position with grace and dignity, though a few struggled with the transition from being the most famous people on Earth to being former astronauts whose greatest achievement was permanently in the past. Neil Armstrong, in particular, seemed to find celebrity uncomfortable and spent much of the rest of his life trying to deflect attention from his personal role in the moon landing to the thousands of people who had made it possible. He rarely gave interviews, avoided most public appearances, and consistently insisted that walking on the moon had been a privilege that could just as easily have belonged to any of the other astronauts who had trained for the mission. Buzz Aldrin took a different approach, embracing his role as a public advocate for space exploration and spending decades promoting ambitious plans for Mars missions and permanent lunar bases that never quite garnered the political support necessary to move from PowerPoint presentations to actual hardware. He also struggled with alcoholism and depression, which he discussed openly in his later years, providing a reminder that even the most extraordinary achievements don't necessarily provide immunity from ordinary human problems. Michael Collins wrote eloquently about his experience as the command module pilot who had remained in lunar orbit while his crewmates made history on the surface, describing the loneliness of being temporarily cut off from all human contact during the 48 minutes of each orbit when the spacecraft passed behind the moon. He pointed out that while Armstrong and Aldrin were famous for being the first humans on the moon, he was famous for being the first human to be completely alone while two other humans were on the moon, which was a more complex kind of distinction, but no less historically significant. The other Apollo astronauts who walked on the moon found various ways to cope with having achieved something that could never be repeated in their lifetimes. Some became advocates for space exploration, others returned to military careers, and a few went into business or politics. All of them remained acutely aware that they had participated in something that would be remembered long after everything else about the 20th century had been forgotten. The engineers and scientists who had made the moon landing possible mostly returned to more conventional careers, though many of them spent the rest of their professional lives working on projects that seemed mundane compared to sending humans to another world. The rocket engineers who had built the Saturn V found themselves designing satellites and unmanned probes. The spacecraft designers who had created the command module and lunar module moved on to space stations and shuttle programs that were technically impressive but lacked the romantic appeal of lunar exploration. NASA itself never quite recovered from the end of Apollo, spending the following decades launching space shuttles and building space stations that were marvels of engineering, but never captured the public imagination the way that moon missions had. The agency that had accomplished the impossible in the 1960s found itself reduced to more modest goals like maintaining a permanent human presence in low Earth orbit and launching scientific probes to study the solar system from a safe distance. The space shuttles were supposed to make spaceflight routine and affordable, but they turned out to be more complex and expensive than anyone had anticipated. And the loss of Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003 served as brutal reminders that spaceflight remained dangerous despite decades of experience and technological improvements. The shuttle program lasted 30 years and accomplished many important goals, but it never achieved the transformative impact that Apollo had demonstrated was possible when America committed its full resources to space exploration. The International Space Station became a symbol of international cooperation in space, bringing together former Cold War enemies in a joint project that would have been impossible during the 1960s. But while the station was an impressive achievement in engineering and diplomacy, it also represented a retreat from the bold ambitions that had characterized the Apollo era, when NASA had been willing to attempt things that seemed impossible rather than limiting itself to things that seemed achievable. In the decades following Apollo, various presidents announced plans to return to the moon or send humans to Mars, but none of these initiatives received the sustained political and financial support that would have been necessary to turn them into reality. The American political system seemed capable of sustaining expensive, long-term projects only during periods of national crisis or intense international competition, and after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there was no obvious rival to motivate the kind of commitment that had made Apollo possible. China's emergence as a space power in the 21st century briefly raised the possibility that a new space race might rekindle American interest in ambitious human spaceflight goals. But the Chinese lunar program proceeded at a measured pace that seemed designed to demonstrate technical competence, rather than achieve dramatic firsts, and the American response was more concerned with maintaining technological superiority than with inspiring public enthusiasm for space exploration. Private companies like SpaceX began developing new rockets and spacecraft that promised to reduce the cost of space travel, and some entrepreneurs announced plans for lunar tourism and Mars colonization that echoed the ambitious rhetoric of the Apollo era. But while these private efforts achieved impressive technical successes, they lacked the scope and urgency that had driven the original moon program. When the full resources of the world's most powerful nation had been focused on a single, clearly defined goal, the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 in 2019 prompted widespread reflection on what America had achieved and what it had lost when the moon program ended. The technological capabilities that had made lunar missions possible still existed, but the political will and public enthusiasm that had sustained those missions for nearly a decade had proven more fragile and harder to recreate. Some historians argued that Apollo had been an aberration, a unique convergence of circumstances that was unlikely to be repeated. The combination of Cold War competition, economic prosperity, and charismatic leadership that had made the moon program possible might never occur again, making Apollo a singular achievement in human history rather than the first step toward routine space travel that its supporters had envisioned. Others maintained that Apollo had demonstrated what was possible when humanity set aside its differences and focused on a common goal, and that the lessons learned from the moon program could be applied to other challenges that required long-term commitment and international cooperation. Climate change, poverty, disease, and other global problems might benefit from the same kind of sustained, coordinated effort that had put humans on the moon. But regardless of whether Apollo's approach could be replicated for other goals, its achievement remained unprecedented and probably unrepeatable under the same circumstances. America in the 1960s had possessed a unique combination of resources, motivation, and political unity that had allowed it to accomplish something that still seemed almost impossible 50 years later. The moon rocks collected by Apollo astronauts continued to provide new insights into the history of the solar system decades after they were brought back to Earth. Samples that had been stored unopened since the 1970s were finally analyzed using techniques that hadn't existed during the original missions, revealing details about the moon's formation and early history that had been impossible to determine from telescopic observations. The scientific legacy of Apollo extended far beyond lunar geology. The technologies developed for the moon program had contributed to advances in computing, materials science, telecommunications, and dozens of other fields. The management techniques pioneered by NASA for coordinating complex projects involving thousands of people and hundreds of companies had been adapted for everything from commercial aircraft development to medical research. Perhaps most importantly, Apollo had demonstrated that humans were capable of leaving Earth and surviving in the hostile environment of space for extended periods. The knowledge gained from lunar missions would be essential for any future attempts to establish permanent human settlements on other worlds, whether on the moon, Mars, or elsewhere in the solar system. The 12 men who walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972 remained the only humans ever to stand on the surface of another world, a distinction that seemed likely to persist for decades longer than anyone had expected during the optimistic years following Apollo 11. Their footprints in the lunar soil would remain unchanged for millions of years, preserved in a world without wind or rain to erase them, serving as permanent monuments to humanity's first steps into the cosmos. America had become the first and, so far, only nation to land humans on the moon through a combination of political determination, engineering brilliance, and sheer audacity that had seemed impossible at the time and looked even more remarkable in hindsight. The achievement had cost enormous amounts of money, required the coordinated efforts of hundreds of thousands of people, and succeeded despite technical challenges that would have defeated any previous generation of human beings. The moon landing remained proof that humans could accomplish almost anything if they were willing to commit the necessary resources and sustain the effort long enough to overcome the inevitable setbacks and failure that accompanied any attempt to do something that had never been done before. It was a reminder that the limits of human achievement were often defined more by imagination and political will than by technical constraints, and that the most important barriers to progress were frequently self-imposed rather than imposed by the laws of physics. In the end, America had gone to the moon for reasons that had as much to do with national pride and Cold War competition as with scientific curiosity or human exploration. But regardless of the motivations that had made it possible, the achievement itself transcended politics and nationalism to become a triumph for the entire species. Humanity had taken its first steps toward becoming a spacefaring civilization, and while those steps had been followed by a long pause, the knowledge and capabilities developed during the Apollo era would make the next steps possible whenever humanity decided it was ready to resume its journey to the stars.